Thank you so much. What a lovely, lovely introduction. I wish my skeptical young adult children could have heard that. It's so lovely to be here. Thank you very, very much for inviting me. I'm here because one day in the early 20-teens, in the big, busy emergency room of the hospital where I worked as a palliative care consultant for the last 15 years of my career, I was called because a family had come in with a blue-lighted elderly patient who'd been having external cardiac massage from the paramedics in the ambulance. And we'd been doing a lot of work with the front-of-house services to start to discern when people were so sick that they could die, which was the phrase we asked them to use, sick enough to die, so sick that they could die, so that families could prepare themselves, and if there was a medical triumph, then obviously everybody would be bathed in glory. But on those occasions when, in fact, the steamer couldn't be turned, that death didn't come as a complete surprise, and the sort of care you would want to have put in place had been put in place. So we'd been doing this piece of work, and we got called because this elderly man's family seemed to be particularly bewildered around him. And when I got there, what I realized was going on was that the dad, who was in his late 90s, on a trolley, breathing, very, very low blood pressure, back in sinus rhythm on his monitor, but heart not really doing very much, who had a set of notes like this, volume 3. I think an executive summary of his organ failures was that his liver was grand. And his wife and one of his sons had driven in a car behind the ambulance, and his other son had come in the ambulance behind him. And what was happening was that these sons couldn't bear what was happening. And I said to them, you know, looking at your dad's backstory here, it seems to me that he's been a bit of a creaking gate for quite a long time. What did he ever say he would want to happen if he was so sick that he might die? And they looked completely bewildered. They looked really startled. And then one of them said, actually, Joe, I feel really terrible. Dad tried to talk to me about that once. He tried to have a conversation about what he would want to happen if he was dying. And I said, sure, Dad, don't be maudlin. And I changed the subject. And then he filled up, he welled up. And his brother, very supportively, came and did that. I don't know what it's like in Ireland, but here's a northeast bloke thing where he came to stand beside his brother. So they're standing shoulder to shoulder, and he reached out comfortingly to pat him on the arm and said, it wasn't just you. Dad tried to talk to me about making a power of attorney so that I could help Mum with the decision-making if something like this ever happened. And I said, Dad, man, you're going to live forever. These little boys who loved their daddy were in their late 60s and early 70s, but they were still little boys. They were still little boys who loved their daddy and who couldn't bear it. And their mother said, it's time to let him go, boys. Because the parents had been able to discuss it, but they hadn't been able to discuss it with their sons. Now, I've seen that scenario many, many times, and I'm sure a lot of you have. But that family stuck with me. That family changed me because a light bulb came on in my head. We can't keep trying to have this conversation one family at a time. This is a public health issue. This is a national understanding of dying issue. It isn't a palliative care job. It isn't an emergency room job. It isn't an intensive care unit, can we allocate you a ventilator or not job. This is a national understanding of dying conversation that somehow has to happen. So I wandered around thinking somebody's got to do something about the public understanding of dying. Somebody's got to do, somebody who understands dying, somebody who's seen a lot of dying, somebody's got to do something about it. Somebody who's seen people dying at home, somebody who's done some hospice work, sure. Probably somebody who's mainly worked in hospital, because that's where a lot of deaths, oh my God. So that's why I'm here, guys, and I'm really, really proud of this transition of the slide, because obviously, usually at ends of life, it's in the other direction. So what I'd like you to do, I'm going to give you 2 minutes, and we are a bit pressed for time, so it will only be 2 minutes, for you to turn to the person next to you who is going to die. And I'd like you to calculate how many deaths you have been involved with, in whatever way, at home, professionally. How many deaths thus far in your life do you think you have been involved with? 2 minutes. 1 minute. So doesn't a minute fly by when you're having fun, counting dead people? Well done. Thank you for joining in. You'll have to stop because otherwise we'll never get home, and some people have got some football to get to. Okay. So I'd like to invite you now to do a show of hands thing. So anybody who has ever been alongside a person during their dying, whether you were there for their last breath or not, raise your hand. Okay. And now keep your hand up. Everybody's hand staying up. Keep your hand up if you've been there for the moment of the last breath. Okay, so look around the room. This is a thing. Turn around and have a look at each other. Because when I do this in public, this doesn't happen. Okay? If you've been there for more than 10 people as they died, keep your hand up. Right, the rest of you might want to look around now and choose your friends carefully. If you've been around for more than 50 people dying, please keep your hands up. Where are the nearest guards? If you've been there for more than 100 people dying, please keep your hands up. And raise them proudly high. Okay, I'm starting to spot my tribe in the audience. More than 1,000 deaths. More than 5,000 deaths. More than 10,000 deaths. Oh. I'm not doing this because it's a competition. Although if it was, I'd have won. I'm doing it because what I want to get across is that I'm not talking about how my dad died. I'm not talking about how my cousin died. I'm not talking about how my friend died. I'm talking about death. And the way palliative care doctors work is in big multidisciplinary teams where half of a doctor is responsible to about 5 or 6 extremely scary nurses who've each got a massive caseload. And you might also be lucky enough to have allied healthcare professionals and a social worker in your team and a chaplain in your team. But you're the go-to doctor if the dying isn't going right, so you would know if it wasn't going right. And you would go and you would help to sort it out. So through the teams that I've been involved with, I've done these so many times because I keep not believing the truth of them. But I've been involved in the end-of-life care of something between 10 and 15,000 people. And what I notice around those deathbeds is that the nurses usually that I'm working with are very, very good at recognizing the approach of dying and involving the family who need to be involved in end-of-life care and trying to help families to be present at the moment that breathing stops, because there's something very important to people about having first-hand experience rather than people telling them what happened afterwards. So when you think about the deaths that you've been involved with, I'd like you to just consider for a moment what, if this was a room full of the general public, they might have experienced, because the hands would have stopped going up at 10, and that would have been very few anyway. And what their experience would have been is very little experience of actual dying, but loads of experience of stuff on screens, stuff in the media, stuff that's really, really frightening. 100 years ago, it would have been very different. People would have seen dying, they'd have seen it very regularly. I probably would have been dead by now. I certainly would have looked after and buried both of my parents by now. I might have buried some of my siblings and maybe some of my children. My nana was born in 1900. She was the age of the year, which was handy for remembering. And she lived this life across the 20th century where her life expectancy at birth was 43. Female child born in poverty in the wrong end of Liverpool in 1900, life expectancy 43. Of course, by the time she was 43, she was very busy. She was in the middle of a war. She had by then buried her husband. A child had died of diphtheria. She had 4 surviving children. She was juggling living in poverty. By the time she died, when she was 97, she was a little bit surprised. Because what had happened was that 20th century medicine had stopped people from dying in their prime. It had transformed our experience of dying and where death took place. Dying was something that was resisted by medicine, and when the death happened, it was as a failure of the medical process to save the life. Whereas 100 years ago, it was common knowledge, it was the stuff of novels. And actually, the well-written novel is a good place to contemplate the human condition, living and dying and grief. But we have moved on, and the people who live in all of the countries that delegates are representing here, instead of having great expectations, now have moved on to having grossly unrealistic expectations, and that is a problem. Because we've got a whole load of new death myths going on now. So, for example, the British soap operas, which I know get onto Irish television as well, they do a little YouTube video at the end of each year of the deaths from that year. Did you know that? And if you look at EastEnders, in the early days of EastEnders in the 1990s, there were 2 or 3 deaths a year. But it's really, really dangerous to live in Albert Square these days. 10 or a dozen deaths. And all of the soap operas do this because it's about maintaining audience. And you don't want people to get up and die in the middle of the death scene, so the death scene's got to be enthralling. And frankly, if you've sat beside somebody who's dying quietly with gentle breathing, if you don't love that person, or you're not that person yourself, it's about as interesting as watching paint dry. So it doesn't make good drama for television, and so they soap it up. And that is what people believe. Of course, luckily, we have a major communication newspaper that loves the National Health Service called the Daily Mail to help people to understand what really happens as people are dying. And in fact, we've got this interesting binary approach to dealing with dying. On the one hand, we don't want to talk about the reality of it, but on the other hand, death as entertainment is absolutely thriving. I am really proud to be in a conference where I'm the second person to mention zombies in an afternoon. That's never happened before. But one of the death myths that we really do have to deal with is the beliefs about outcomes of CPR. Because in hospital dramas, within 10 minutes of having had CPR, 2/3 of patients are sitting up, having a cup of tea, and planning their discharge. And that is not a reality. So we have to find new ways to get those stories told. Where once it was novels, we've now got new media to use. And what's interesting is watching people taking to the internet as a vehicle for telling stories. So this is a podcast that was begun in the UK by a journalist called Rachel Bland, who was a young mum diagnosed at diagnosis with stage 4 breast cancer. And she started originally blogging about her cancer, and she joined up with another couple of young women, one who had breast cancer, probably curable, who was going through her treatment at the time, and another young mother who had presented with stage 4 bowel cancer. So these 3 women put together this podcast, and because Rachel Bland was a journalist for the BBC, it was supported by the might of BBC Radio 5 Live, so it's all recorded in a really posh studio in Salford. And they have done great things informing a huge, many thousands of people in their community, thinking about the day-to-day implications of having an advanced life-limiting illness and still getting on with the business of living. And they also have taken me under their wing, so I've been down to Salford to play with them and chat, and it's absolutely fantastic service they're doing. This is a blog of a young woman who was a sixth former when she started it, and I knew about it because her mum was a palliative care consultant a few cities away from where I worked, who was at the time dying of cancer, and her daughter blogged all the way through her mum's terminal illness and is now continuing to blog in her bereavement, and she herself now is at university. Clare Wise was a TV producer and a film producer whose brother Greg Wise you might know as the other half of Dame Emma Thompson, thank you very much. And he's an actor and a producer, and she kept a blog to keep all of her friends up to date during her breast cancer treatment. And when she was dying, she would only let him look after her. So he took to writing the blog to update it for her friends, and it became his evening meditation. And it's absolutely moving, and in fact, because of that, he was invited to turn it into a book. So it's not just the electronic space, there's also still paper. And so high-profile people like Linda Bellingham writing about her bowel cancer, Greg and Clare Wise's book, which is simply their unedited blog, which makes absolutely fascinating reading, or just wonderful books like Paul Kalanithe's When Breath Becomes Air. Each of these are stories of individuals, and they tell us something about the human condition, and they tell us something about the relationship of medicine and practitioners to our patients and their families, and we can learn loads from them. They're very particular, though. What they don't do is look at the big picture of what it is about the human condition in general that are the stories that we can tell. So let's just have a think for a moment about what happens around a bed when somebody's dying, the patterns that we recognize, how we know when to tell the family to get the family around the bed. How do we tell people to behave at the deathbed? So we know that there is a pattern. We know that it's recognizable. Just simple things like telling people to bring their slippers in and a newspaper, because when people visit hospital, they sit beside the bed, they grab the hand, they make eye contact, and they talk. And people who love each other, who live in the same space at home, we don't do that, do we? Or is it just my house? We kind of ignore each other. We've got enough space to even be in different rooms from each other. We meet, our water cooler is actually the kettle. He drinks coffee, I drink tea. And we kind of exchange how we're getting on, and then we move off and we do things again. And we need to help families to reinvent that kind of comfortable space around the bed. And we need to explain to them what is going on in real time. We need to narrate the deathbed, and I'm going to come back to talk about that. So there's a space still for us to talk about those things, to narrate our stories. And I think perhaps the first and possibly the greatest of those types of invitations to think about how people die and what the interaction between medicine and dying people should look like is this fantastic book from Atul Gawande. Now, I have to tell you that Atul Gawande was invited by the BBC to give the Wreath Lectures a few years ago, and I didn't know who he was. All I knew was that the BBC, in the land of Cicely Saunders, had invited an American surgeon to talk about dying. I was incandescent. So I'm driving between my hospital and my hospice when Sue Lawley, who's our announcer, came on to announce the first of the Wreath Lectures. And she introduced this book-writing doctor person from America. And I'm driving along thinking, yeah. And then he began his talk. And by 10 minutes in, I had had to pull over to the side of the road to find my handkerchief and just listen to this compelling orator speaking to me about the people that I look after in a way that understood it at least as well and possibly more well than I understood it myself. What a magnificent gift. So I bought the book. So it's fantastic. But what's wonderful about it is the humility with which he describes his change of heart, his invitation to his palliative care attending to make rounds with him on a surgical ward where she does nothing. She makes everybody sit down, and then she just asks questions. She doesn't even get her stethoscope out. And what he learned was that process of guided discovery that enabled him to frame his question, what matters most, the question that he wants to teach every medical student in America and that we should really be teaching every medical student, every healthcare student in the world. And then to apply that new knowledge to his own beloved father. Here in the west of Ireland, we have the lovely Dr. Seamus O'Mahony, very experienced doctor who has written a tirade about the inelegance of hospital dying. And it is a call to arms for us to think about how we sculpt and change our practice. And some of you may know that I wrote a book too. Now, I'd only ever written for medical journals where you deliver your manuscript on time because otherwise you miss publication, right? So I sent in my manuscript for the book on the right day, and my editor rang me a little bit puzzled. Apparently that's not what usually happens. And she said, it's marvellous, marvellous, darling, darling, lovely, lovely. Because it's very different from talking to orthopedic surgeons. And she said, just two problems. One, there are too many Christmases. And two, there are too many cups of tea. Now, actually, Christmas in our society is a very, very important time, isn't it? So, in fact, we do have a lot of Christmases in palliative care. We start Christmas round about October for people who might not make it. Some of the October Christmas people do get a second Christmas in December, and they've already given the gifts away. But, you know, that seems to be okay. So I was not prepared to compromise about the cups of tea, but I did compromise about the Christmases. So you'll find that there's Valentine's Day and wedding anniversaries and birthdays and all sorts in the book, but if you read the book, they were all Christmases. But the thing that I feel passionate about is that when we're having these, we tend to call them difficult conversations. I think that we make it difficult by calling them difficult conversations. When we're having these tender conversations, we need there to be no power imbalance. So I have gone around the northeast of England making cups of tea and having a cup of tea with a person with whom I was about to have a very tender conversation. And she phoned me to say, I can't wait for you to see the cover of the paperback. So, this is what we are about, that everybody who's going to die wants and needs to know this. What is dying like? Will I be able to bear it? And am I going to terrify the wits out of my family? So I am going to tell you the story of how I found out what dying was like. I'd been qualified as a doctor for several years. I'd worked in the regional leukemia centre, I'd worked in the regional cancer centre, I did medicine and the medical membership exams as my postgraduate thing, was going to go into oncology, and then just found the patients who weren't going to survive just much more interesting. There were really clever people looking for the cure for cancer, and it was dull. So I moved across to work in a hospice, and we had this magnificent French lady who had been a member of the French resistance. She'd married the English airman who'd parachuted in behind enemy lines to help them to build radios. She'd come to live in England. She had never lost her cut glass French accent. I'm not going to attempt to impersonate her because I'll sound like a bad episode of Allo, Allo, but it was absolutely fantastic. And she started wearing a red and black ribbon on her caftan, because she didn't have a dressing gown, darlings. She had a caftan. And I didn't know what that was, but my boss, whose father had been a resistance hero, been decorated for his work with the resistance, knew that this was a resistance ribbon. And she told us that she'd taken to wearing it because she was afraid that her courage might fail. And if her courage failed, then she would be in a state of mortal sin as she died, and therefore she couldn't go to heaven, and therefore she would never be reunited with her husband, who died about 5 years previously, who was very brave, who said all the prayers with the priest before he died. So this was an existential fear, but it was a fear of having pain that would induce despair. So my boss said to her, I wonder if it would help you if I described to you what dying will be like. And I thought, wait, what now? And she patted the bed and sparkled at him. So he sat down, and I sat on one of, what are those little stools that they have? What are they about? I sat on one of those, so I could see her face. And he said to her, the thing is that I can talk to you about this, but I have to know that you will stop me if it gets uncomfortable. Will you stop me if it gets uncomfortable for you? And she said, yes, oui. So he said, well, what we notice in all the illnesses that people die of is that towards the end of people's lives, it's really pretty similar. They just kind of run out of energy, and they need a lot more sleep to recharge their batteries. And you might already be noticing that. And she said, oui. And he said, oh, well, that's good. And I'm thinking, what? That's good? And he said, no, that's good because that means you're following the normal pattern. And what we expect to happen now is gradually that you will sleep more and be awake less. And that when you are awake, you'll be you. As time goes by, we'll find that sometimes when you're asleep, we can't wake you up. And when people need to be woken up for medicines or phone calls and we can't waken them, that tells us that they're actually dipping in and out of unconsciousness. Do you want me to say that in French? And she said, no, I understand, unconscious, oui. So as time goes by, people are awake less, they're asleep more, and gradually they become unconscious. And once we're completely unconscious, the only bit of our brain that's still working is the bit that controls the breathing. And once we're doing that reflex breathing, we will have to talk to your family while that's happening. Because sometimes it's deep, and it can be a bit snory, I'm afraid, and slow. And sometimes it's faster, sometimes it's shallower. And we need your family to understand that the deep, slow breathing, those noises are not distress, it's not groaning. It's just very, very deep unconsciousness. And sometimes when the breathing is fast and a little bit shallow, if families didn't know any better, they could think that people were breathless. So we will check that you're not breathless, but we will also explain to them that this breathing is a reflex because your brain is switching off and only the breathing is still working. And then as time goes by, we notice that the breathing gets slower, and gradually there are pauses. And I'm sitting on my stool thinking, oh my God, he's got to stop in a moment. This is just absolutely awful. He is going to describe dying to this woman. And she is sitting up higher and higher in her bed with her eyes locked on his, and she's holding his hand like a rope. And she's nodding. And as his head moves, her head moves. And she is entranced. And she never asks him to stop. And at the very end of life, he says to her, in those gaps between breaths, eventually there'll be an in-breath and an out-breath, and then no more breaths. No sudden pain at the end, no sudden feeling of fading away or panic. It's very, very gentle. And she got hold of both of his hands, and she pulled them, and she kissed his hands and said, thank you. And she folded herself back onto the pillows, and she closed her eyes. And in a way that a scary French woman can, she told us that we were dismissed. what did I learn? What did I learn from that story? Well, I'd already seen several hundred deaths, and as he was describing the dying, my surprise was that it was possible to describe the dying and that you could take the patient with you, even though I was incredibly shocked that he'd proposed to do that. And everything that he described, I recognized. The problem was, I'd never stood back and looked at it before because I was the junior doctor. I was trying to sort out the low oxygen and the high potassium and the low blood pressure and what's that ionized calcium doing, and have the ITU people arrived for that consult yet? I was so busy trying to juggle all the variables, I never saw the pattern. But this is the pattern of guinea pigs dying. It's the pattern of chimpanzees dying. It's the pattern of animals dying. It's the pattern of human beings dying. And so I want to invite you to be recruits in this campaign for the retelling of this really, really important story, because we need to become midwives of dying. When somebody is pregnant, they immediately, after they've ceased weeping and got over the shock, begin an intensive phase of preparation. They meet a midwife. The midwife explains what their condition is going to be like over the next several months, and she introduces them to what will happen during labor. Nothing that happens on Labor Day should be a surprise. Everything is a sequence of events that feels completely individual to the woman in labor and is the same set of events that every midwife always sees. There are plans for whether we're going to go for a normal trial of labor or whether already, because we know this person well through the pregnancy and their antenatal care, there might be reasons to think there may need to be an instrumental delivery, there may need to be a cesarean section. Can you see where I'm going with this? So we have a period of antenatal care when people are approaching death, because the process of dying itself only consists of organ failure, brain switching off, reflex breathing, and cessation of breathing. That's it. Doesn't cause pain, doesn't cause breathlessness, doesn't cause seizures, but the underlying condition can cause any, all, and even more symptoms than that. So during this antenatal period is the time to tailor the symptom management, to get it really right, and to have the plan for what normal dying will be like and what kit we might need around to manage that. But also for this person with a brain tumour, should they have seizures, what additional emergency kit will we need? And for this person with bowel cancer, if they should start to get colic, what additional symptom management might we need? So that there is a plan for the likely eventualities. And that means that when we get to delivery day or dying day, instead of the person and the family hearing this information for the first time, we're doing like a midwife. This breathing, this is that thing that we talked about. How's your dad looking today? Has he been this comfortable all night? That's fantastic. Yeah, I can see you're doing an absolutely great job, because midwives encourage the companions around the bed. They're not just about the woman in labor. You are creating a safe space here for your husband. You're doing so great that you're sitting on the bed, cuddling your dad. Fantastic. Well done. I bet he loves that cuddle. Yeah, breathing is making that funny noise, isn't it? And it sounds like drowning to you. I'm really sorry it sounds like drowning. Let me explain a little bit. She's got a little bit of phlegm in the back of her throat. Imagine if you had a bit of a cup of tea and a little bit got stuck and went down the wrong way. What would you do? Yeah, you're right, you would. You'd cough, wouldn't you? Or you'd swallow. Yeah, you might gag. Let's have another look at her. Is she doing any of those things? She's not, is she? Because the back of her throat, which has got such great nerve endings to protect us from choking, she can't feel it anymore. Her brain is so unconscious that it's even switched that very precious reflex off. So it's air going in and out of her lungs. It's just bubbling through that little film of fluid. She isn't drowning. She isn't struggling. She doesn't know she's making a noise. But we can hear it. Yeah, you're right. That's the noise we call the death rattle. Very good. And it tells me that this person is deeply, deeply unconscious and not feeling distress. That's a really reassuring noise. So we need, ladies and gentlemen, to be changing the public understanding of dying. And the only opportunity we're really going to get to do that is around deathbeds. So every patient offers us the opportunity to change understanding for the family, for the village, for the important people around that bed. And even though the death is individual, for us the patterns are familiar, we know what to expect. We've got to stop messing around with daft language about passing and being lost. This person is dying, and soon they will be dead because a death is happening. We have to use our D words, and we have to narrate it as it's happening so that people don't leave the deathbed thinking that they saw something deeply traumatic. I have had hundreds of letters from people who've read my book saying, I thought my dear person died in agony. All those noises you're describing, I heard. And I now realize that they were unconscious and that they were peaceful and the disturbance was mine. Why didn't anybody tell me? That's not good enough. We have to be narrating dying. It's time for us to change that public understanding. So I want you now to take a moment to ask yourself, what will you do next week, back at the ranch, to change the way your patients and their families approach the end of life? Because that is our precious and sacred task. Nobody else will do this for us. It's time to talk about dying. I really, really want to thank the dotMD team for inviting me to talk, and the bookshop for selling my book, which is really exciting. I'm here because I learnt about dying from nurses more than from doctors, and from patients and families, and I owe them a huge debt of gratitude. And William Collins took a punt on a book about death, and I absolutely deeply appreciate that they did, for the sake of every single one of those letters that I've had where a bereavement has been transformed by knowing more about dying. Let's go out and change it, ladies and gentlemen.